put up a poll to see what you're interested in for this month, Christmas in July or everyday/summer decor, and it was almost a tie. So all of the projects in this video can be made for Christmas or left up all year, and I'm showing you how. Thanks for coming to hang out with me today. If you're new, my name's Jess. I'm excited to share these crafts with you. I hope you're excited too. Let's get started. A little while ago, I posted a video with a bunch of different wood round projects. After the video went live, I had another idea for a double-sided wood round, so I figured this would be the perfect time to share that. I'm using a wood round from Hobby Lobby that's about 14 inches. I'm also using one of the metal signs from the Dollar Tree, one of their reusable wallpaper stickers, and some ribbon, and I also made a decal using my Cricut. To get started, I wanted both sides of my wood round to be the same color, so I'm using some of the Antique Wax by Waverly, and I'm giving a coat to both sides using a wet wipe to apply it. While that was drying, I grabbed the metal word sign from the Dollar Tree and I gave it 2 coats of green chalk paint. Now that my wood round is dry, I laid it out on my grid mat so that I could have a ruler underneath it. I found the center of the circle and I laid a piece of painter's tape right across the middle so that I could divide it in half. Before I continued on, I also found the center at the top of the wood round and I marked it with a pencil so that I would know where the top was on both sides, since this is going to be a double-sided wood round. Then I took some red chalk paint and I started painting the bottom half of the one side with that. I was really careful around the edges. I was only pulling straight down because I wanted to make sure that I didn't accidentally slip my brush underneath the wood round and get red on the other side. I also pulled the paint straight down from the tape so that none of it would get under the tape also. After my red paint was dried, I took my painter's tape and starting in the center, I laid a piece down. Then I used another small piece as a spacer and I went the whole way across on both sides creating stripes. I always like to start in the center of a project when I'm creating stripes because I think it just looks better if the stripe in the middle is centered, and then that way you have about the same amount on each side, because sometimes the stripes on both sides can be a little bit shorter, so I think it just looks better if it's evenly spaced. With my tape all in place, I was ready to add my second color. I'm using some white chalk paint here, and I did have to give it 2 coats because with just one coat you could still see some of the red through it and it made it look a little pink. Now I did the same thing with the white paint as I did with the red paint. I just pulled everything straight down and I was really careful not to get the bristles of my brush underneath the wood round because I didn't want any white on the other side. Once I pulled all the painter's tape off, I noticed there were some places that looked a little distressed where I didn't quite get a full coverage, and I actually really liked that. So I took out a piece of sandpaper and I started sanding down the stripes to distress the color, and I also wanted to distress the harsh line that was created across the center, and I wanted to reveal a little bit of the wood through the edges of the paint. I laid my grid mat back down and I put the wood round on top of it and I lined that center stripe line up with one of the lines on my grid mat. This just helped so that when I laid my decal down, I got it nice and straight and it was easier for me to center. This decal I cut out on my Cricut. It was just one of the free designs they have in Design Space, and I just used some black vinyl to cut it out. But before I put the decal down, I thought that the way this wood round looked, it would also make for a really cool patriotic project. You could add some kind of patriotic saying to it and add some blue stars, and I think that would look really cool too. Now on the other side of the wood round, I found that pencil mark that I had put earlier to indicate where the top of my wood round would be and where the center is. I laid that pencil mark to the side on my grid mat and then I used some double-sided tape. I went a few inches over from the center because the next design I wanted it to cover about 1/3 of the wood round. So I'm using some double-sided tape here. I went about 2 inches from the center and I laid a piece down. So remember, this isn't actually the bottom half of this sign. This is the left side of this sign. I moved that pencil mark to the left. It was just easier for me to put this double-sided tape on if I had it going the other direction. After I had that first piece in place, then I added a few extra pieces just for more adhesive on that side. I removed all the backing from the double-sided tape that I had laid down, and then I grabbed that piece of wallpaper sticker that I had got from the Dollar Tree. The nice thing about these stickers is they do have the backing split so that you can just pull off one section to start. Now, this is where I kind of messed up a little bit. I should have pulled the entire backing off of this wallpaper sticker, because once I had laid down the wallpaper over that double-sided tape, the backer that I did not pull off actually stuck to the double-sided tape. So rather than trying to pull everything off, I just went with it and I laid it all down on top of the double-sided tape. You probably wouldn't have to use the double-sided tape, but the reason I did it is because I wasn't sure how sticky this wallpaper would actually be, because it is advertised to be removable, and I wanted to make sure that it was really stuck on there. So once I had that in place, then I used my utility knife and I just cut off all of the excess wallpaper. I grabbed that metal word sign that I had painted earlier, and I'm using a mixture of this Fix-All adhesive from the Dollar Tree and some hot glue to adhere it to the front of the sign. The reason I'm doing that is because it is metal, so I know the hot glue won't hold it for a long time, so I like to add a little bit of this Fix-All adhesive, which is about the same as the E6000 if that's something that you like to use. I used a lot of the Fix-All adhesive, and I just used a couple dots of the hot glue just to hold it in place for me. Now you can probably see on this sign that there are 2 holes at the top of it. I'm not sure why they put those there. That didn't really bother me, so I just painted right over it. But if seeing those holes is something that would bother you, you could always fill that in with a little bit of spackle or even a little bit of hot glue. Next, I started creating a bow for the top of my wood round. I grabbed some of this burlap ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I formed 2 loops that were about the same length, and I also cut a third piece to act as the tails. Once I had all of the pieces cut, then I took some jute twine. I cinched everything in the center and tied it. I made sure that the tails of the jute twine were pretty long so that I could tie it around the top of the wood round. Since this wood round didn't have a hole at the top, I needed to create one so that I could hang it. I have this tool called a crocodile that comes in really handy in my craft room. It punches through a lot of different materials like thinner wood like this or chipboard. I've even punched through bottle caps. So I just punched a hole, and I used that pencil mark that I still had at the top center to show me where I needed it. Then I took some jute twine and I strung it through, and then to give it a little more interest, I added some white wooden beads that I already had in my stash to create a pretty hanger. Since I left the jute twine nice and long on my bow, I could tie it on to the top of the wood round, and it can be tied on either side, or it could just be hung up without a bow. I think it looks good either way. Scrapbook paper is a great way to make signs that you can change out for the different seasons and holidays. To make the base of my sign, I'm using a 14 by 11 inch canvas. I have a wooden family word sign, but they also sell metal signs. I'm using a piece of chipboard that's going to fit on the back of my frame, and I already marked it with the center. And I have 2 different paper packs here that I'm going to use, one for Christmas, one for every day. They're both really pretty, and they're both by Echo Park, which is some of my favorite scrapbook paper. I'm using my utility knife to remove the canvas material from the frame. For this project, I won't need the material, but I'm going to hold on to it because I'm sure I'll use it later. I wasn't worried about the staples in the back of the frame. They weren't going to bother me for this project. Once I had all of the material off of the frame, then I used some of the Antique Wax by Waverly to give it a nice coat of stain. And while that was drying, I took a smaller paintbrush and I started giving my wooden family word 1 coat of white chalk paint. I always like to try to plan this out when I'm doing projects. If I know there's different things that I'm going to need to paint or stain and that they're going to need time to dry, I try to do those things first so that I can just set them aside and then move on to other parts of the project. Now that my frame and my word are painted and stained and drying, I'm going to get started on cutting apart my paper. So this paper pack has a ton of different patterns in it, and I'm going to do a quilted design on our piece of chipboard using squares. So it's a really easy pattern to follow. There's a good bit of cutting, but it's just cutting out squares, so it's not very complicated. So the way the pattern is built is you have to use 3 by 3 inch squares, and you also have to use 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares. Now, the number of squares will depend on what size frame you decide to use, but since my frame is a little bit bigger, it's 14 by 11, the chipboard that I cut down is now 9 3/4 by 13 inches. And you can see here, I did go ahead and find the center of both sides of my chipboard, and I put a little cross in the center, and you'll see why a little bit later. So if you're going to use the same size frame that I did, the number of squares that you'll need, so for the 3 by 3 inch squares, you're going to need 10 of these squares altogether. And the 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares, you'll need 40 of these squares altogether. Now what I recommend, and this is what I did, for the 3 by 3 inch square, I went through the paper pack and I picked out a pattern that was a little more subtle. So you can see this one has a darker background. It has these really pretty mistletoe and berries on it, but it's kind of subtle. It's not a very busy pattern, and I'll explain why in a minute. So this is going to be what I cut my 3 by 3 inch squares out of. And then for my 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares, I only picked out 2 patterns. So here I have this really pretty red background with white snowflakes on it, and for this one it's a lighter background with some green ticking stripes going through it. So the reason I picked these 2 for my smaller squares is because these 2 patterns are a little bit more busy. So when I go to lay out my squares on my chipboard, I'll have this as a big square, and I'll have both of these as the smaller squares. That way it doesn't get too busy, and because all of the backgrounds on these 3 pages are a different color, you'll be able to see the big square, a little square, a little square. It'll be nice and separated without having to create a border. It'll make sense once we start putting it together. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of these papers down. Like I said, for the 3 by 3 inch squares, you'll need 10 of those. And for the 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares, you'll need 40 altogether, which means that you'll want to cut 20 from one of your pattern papers and 20 from the other one. I'm going to go ahead and get those cut, and then we'll get back together. Now that I have all of my paper squares cut, so I have my 10 3 by 3s, I have 20 of the 1.5 by 1 in one pattern and 20 of the 1.5 by 1.5 in another pattern. Before I start gluing this down, I need to decide if I want my sign to go portrait or landscape. So because the wooden word that I'm using is so big, and because I do have a bigger frame, I decided I want my sign to go landscape. Now for the patterns that I picked out, it really doesn't matter because they don't have a direction to them. But if you pick out a pattern paper that say is something like this with little Christmas trees on it, you want to make sure you decide if you're going to have your sign go landscape or portrait before you start gluing these down, so that now that I know I want my sign to go landscape, if I were using a pattern that had a direction to it, I know now that if I'm going to use this, I need to make sure that I glue it in a way so that it faces the right direction. But like I said, the patterns that I picked out don't have a direction, so it really doesn't matter how I put them down, except for the stripes that I picked. I do want to make sure that as I'm gluing my stripe pieces down, I always have the stripes going in the same direction. And for me, I think I like the vertical stripes a little bit better, so I'm probably going to be sticking them vertically on my sign. Now as I'm gluing my pieces down, I'm using the art glitter glue. This is my favorite glue for when I'm paper crafting. I just think it dries nice. You have a little bit of time to move the pieces around if you need to, and it doesn't tend to buckle paper, particularly scrapbook paper. It kind of makes it nice and even, and it doesn't give you any of those little wrinkles. Now I buy the bigger bottles like this from Amazon. I'll have all of this linked below. And what I also like to get from Amazon are these smaller bottles. They have a little needle nose tip to them, like a metal tip, and they have this little silicone cover that goes over the tip. So I like to just fill up one of these smaller bottles. I just think they're a little bit easier to work with, and I can just add in a small amount of glue at one time rather than having to mess with a big bottle. So the reason we put this cross in the center of the chipboard is because when you're laying out your pattern, you want to start in the center and work your way out. That way when you lay the frame over it, you should have an even amount of space at the top and the bottom and the left and right side. If you were to start at the bottom, say, and work your way up, when you laid the frame over, you might have a bigger gap of paper on this side and then just a small row on this side. So the easiest way to avoid that is to just put a cross in the center and, like I said, work your way out from the center to the sides. So to get started on the pattern building, I'm going to start with 2 of each of my smaller square patterns, and I'm going to use my cross in the middle as my guide. I'm going to lay 1 striped piece up against the one corner of the cross and the other striped piece diagonal from the first one. So here's one, here's the other. Then I'm going to come in with my snowflake pieces and I'm just going to fill in the other sides of the square. So my finished square is going to look like this, with 2 pattern papers going diagonally here and 2 pattern papers going diagonally here. Okay, so there's my first square. You can see I have 2 and 2. So next to each side of this square is going to go one of our 3x3 squares. So you can see how this pattern is going to be. We're going to start with the 4 pieces, and then there'll be a solid and a solid. That's why I said whenever you're picking out your papers, you want to try to get patterns that will coordinate together. And if you're unsure, just check the background colors of the papers. And if you pick out different background colors, they should coordinate. And like I said, for the bigger squares, I think it looks better if it's a little bit more subtle. It doesn't have such a busy pattern, and then you can keep your busier patterns for your smaller squares. So now I'm going to go ahead and glue a larger square on either side of the 4 square. Now when I'm gluing this down, I want to make sure that my edges line up together pretty tightly, and that'll help me make sure that as I'm laying this square down that it's coming across straight. Now if it goes slightly at an angle across your surface, it's okay. It's not going to be the end of the world. The pattern's still going to look great. But as long as you keep everything pretty tight together and pretty lined up, you shouldn't have any issues as you're building your patterns across the page. They should stay pretty straight and work for you. Now, if that's something that makes you a little bit nervous, if you're not sure, if you're new to paper crafting, if you're not sure if your cuts were right, what you could do is before you start gluing, because you can see like this is a 3x3 square, and once we put these together, this is also a 3x3 square now. So you could take your surface and just grid out with pencil 3x3 squares through the whole thing if you feel like you need a guide going across all of your surface. Now for me, I'm okay if it slants a little bit, but so I'm just gonna use that center cross that I made to start, and then I'll work out from there. So once I have these 2, then the next thing we're going to do is repeat this pattern again on either side of these 2 squares. So here's where you can play around too if you'd like. In this square, I put my 2 stripes here and my 2 snowflakes here. So when I get to this end, and it is going to hang over a little bit, and that's okay, we'll work on that later. I could either repeat this same square and do a stripe at the bottom, a snowflake at the top, and then reverse it the same way it is here, or I could switch it up here and I could do snowflake at the bottom with my stripe at the top, another snowflake, and another stripe. So you see how you can play around. It's the same pattern, but it looks the same, but then it doesn't look the same. Does that make sense? I think it does. So I think I'm going to stick, and I'm going to keep all of my squares just looking like this. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on this side and this side. I'm going to do my stripes in the corners this way and my snowflakes in the corners this way, and I'll get to that and then we'll get back together and work on the rest of the rows. When you reach the end of your chipboard like this, it'll be easier if you apply your glue right to the chipboard rather than to your pattern pieces. That way you're not going to get any glue on your work surface and you don't accidentally glue your squares down to your work surface. So you can see here, I'm just going to put my glue right on my chipboard rather than the back of the paper. And then once I have my paper in place here, this overhang will be a lot easier to cut off because I won't have any glue on the back side of it. So again, just down here, the same thing. I add the glue right to my chipboard, and then I can throw my pattern paper right on there. And then later on, when we go to cut off all these excess pieces, there's no glue on the back here, so it won't ruin my scissors and I won't accidentally glue that down. Okay, now that I have my first row complete, before I move on to the next rows, I am just going to go ahead and get these side pieces cut off. I'm just going to cut along the chipboard here and get all of that cleaned up. It doesn't have to be exact because this is going to be glued on the back of the frame, so if a little bit does hang over, that's okay too. I would hold on to these pieces because when I was figuring out the number of squares you would need for this project, I had originally thought that I was going to create this as a portrait sign. So some of these little pieces, you may need these to fill in some of the gaps. We'll see. So whenever you're cutting these excess off, just put them to the side in case we need them again. But I think the squares will work out the same whether you're doing portrait or landscape. We'll find out and I'll let you know. So if you need a different amount of squares, if you're going to do a landscape sign this size, I'll let you know. And I'll make sure that all of the measurements and cuts that you need will be in the description box below. Okay, so now that this first row is done, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to work on the next row down. So I'm just going to shift everything. So since when I started in the center with my little 4 square, now underneath from that 4 square, I'm going to take one of my solid pieces and see how this little gap is here. We'll work on that later. That may be where these little pieces come into play. We'll see. So next I'm going to take opposite of the square I started with and I'm going to add in one of my 3x3 squares. And then I'm just going to finish out the row the same way I did this one. So once I have this one glued in place, then I'm going to take my 4 square, put it here, and then add another solid square on each end. All right, so this row is done, and guess what? That means up above the middle row that we did, we're gonna repeat this same thing again. So this exact row that I did with the solid piece being in the center, I'm gonna repeat that right above the center row, and it's gonna be the exact same as this one. So as I'm gluing this top paper down, I realized that down here when I created this row, instead of moving this square in the same direction as this square, I mirrored it. So I'm just going to repeat that up here again. So that's what's great about this type of pattern. If you want to flip-flop these squares around, it's no big deal. It looks just as good. I maybe wouldn't have even caught this, except I was looking at this one trying to figure out why this looked different, and it took me a minute to realize that I had mirrored this side. So like I said, I'm just going to do this same square up here and keep going. So now that I have my 3 rows done, the reason I had said to start in the middle is because can you see here how the gap that's left on this side is about the same size as the gap that's left on this side? So as I'm gluing down these final little pieces of paper, the rows will look even. Had I started completely at one side of it, it would have meant I would have had a full row here and then just a partial row at the top. This way my partial rows are on each side. Now this is a pretty small gap, so I probably wouldn't even have to fill it in. I think it might be covered by the frame, but just in case it isn't, I'm gonna go ahead and fill in the paper anyway. So I have plenty of squares left here. I still have 2 full of the solid squares and I have a bunch of the mini squares. So the number of squares I gave you in the beginning will work for this landscape as well. If you didn't want to lay down the entire square like this, you're going to need those for the top as well. You could just glue this down and then use your scrap pieces, like I said, to hold on to those that you cut off the edge to fill in these little things. But you just want to make sure that you repeat the same pattern. So when I get to work up here, I'm going to repeat this square again, but I'm only going to need 2 of these little squares. So I'm going to make sure that I glue my stripe square and my snowflake square right on this little gap that's here, and then I'll fill in with a piece of this scrap from the solid square, and then I'll do 2 more of the smaller squares here on the edge just to make sure that this whole surface is covered. Now the reason that I put a cross on the back side of this too is because I do want to make this sign double-sided. You can see I got all of my Christmas paper on this side, so on this side I'm going to work on an everyday sign that I can keep up year-round. So with the other paper pack that I had, the other one called Country Kitchen, I am going to do this one a little bit different. So instead of making my bigger square the more solid square, I'm actually going to use a pattern for that one because I really love these little roosters and chickens on this one. So I'm going to cut my 3x3s out of this busier paper, and then for my 1.5 by 1.5s, I'm going to use prints that aren't quite as busy and a little bit more subtle. So the polka dot's a little bit busy, but I think because it's spread out, it's going to look okay with these roosters. And then of course I have another stripe because I just love stripes, and this one is very subtle. You can see it almost looks like a solid from far away on the camera. So again, I'm going to cut my 3x3 squares out of the rooster paper, and then my smaller squares I'm going to cut out of the polka dots and the stripe. And I'm going to go through and do the same process as I did on the front side, just on the back side. I'm going to start in the center with my 4 little squares and work my way out to the edges. So here's my other side all complete, and this time I did pay attention when I was making these little 4 squares, and you can see when you do them correctly, all of the little squares will line up with each other. And I wanted to make sure I showed you this because I did choose to use this rooster paper for this one. This is where I said it's important because I do want to keep my sign going landscape. So as I was gluing my bigger squares down with these roosters, I just wanted to make sure that the orientation of the paper was always correct so that I didn't accidentally flip one to the side or the other. And you can also see the difference with this paper versus this one, because like I said, on this one I told you to look for the different color backgrounds if you're having a hard time choosing what patterns to go together, whereas this one, all of the background colors are basically the same. So even though it's a little bit busier with these stripes and polka dots and these roosters, because the background color is all the same, it does help it blend together. And the great thing about using paper pads like that is that all the paper is meant to coordinate together. So if you're truly having a hard time picking out paper, just pick your 3 favorites. They're meant to go together. They'll look great together no matter what you decide. The one thing though I do want to point out, a pattern like this where it's a smaller rooster, if you would choose something like this for these little squares, there's a good chance that you would cut a square out that wouldn't have a whole chicken or a whole rooster on it. So for the little squares, I would avoid any kind of pattern like this that you're not going to be able to get a whole piece of something on because it might look a little bit funny. Now for this one, it was okay that the snowflakes were kind of spread apart because there was enough of them on there and enough of these little ones that even if I didn't get a whole snowflake in the square, you could still tell that it was snowflake paper and it still looked okay. All right, now let's get everything put together. So you can see here that the paint is all dry on my family side, and I just made sure that I got a really good coat across the front. I didn't mind if the edges were a little bit distressed like I mentioned. And also while I'm putting this together, let me know if you're okay with this style of video, because I am going back and forth where I'm talking live as I'm putting things together, and I'm also doing a bit of a voiceover. So I know the audio can sound different between the 2 different microphones I'm using. So let me know if that's something that bothers you, because I can always change it up for the next one. So as I'm gluing this together, now I have to decide, do I want my word sign to be at the bottom of my frame? Do I want it to be in the middle, or should I put it at the top? I'm kind of debating whether I should go in the middle or at the bottom. If I put it at the bottom, you're going to be able to see more of that quilted pattern that I worked on. So I think that's what I'm going to do. Plus it'll give me more surface area to glue my word onto the frame. So for this, because these are both just wood, I am just going to use some hot glue. So when I'm gluing this down, I want to make sure that I'm getting glue mostly where you're going to see it. Like I'm not going to run a whole bead of glue along this bottom frame because I don't want any of the glue to seep through, and I don't want you to be able to see it. So I'm just going to kind of make a mental note of where I know there are going to be pieces touching the frame, and that's where I'm going to add my glue. Since the background of this sign is just made of chipboard and it's nice and light, it doesn't have a lot of weight to it, I'm just going to use some mini Velcro dots to attach it to the frame. So I took 4 of the Velcro dots and I put 1 in each corner of the frame, and then I did the opposite side on each side of the sign. So there's 4 dots in each corner on each side of the sign, if that makes any sense. That way I can just flip it back and forth, and I can have it either set up for Christmas or just for every day. Thanks so much for coming to hang out and craft with me today. Let me know in the comments if you like to make Christmas crafts in July or if you just like to stick with every day. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.